The Vortex Venom second focal plane 1:6 LPVO is another stepping stone in the very low budget LPVO segment. What I mean by that is this is a $300 second focal plane Chinese made LPVO.
Pew pew pew.
There's almost nothing else to really talk about after that.
Pew 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 pew.
If you're already familiar with most of the other scopes that occupy this segment, this isn't going to be that dissimilar. It features a lot of the same components from other scopes from the Vortex lineup. However, there is a bit of a twist. At first, I thought the Venom would be a rehash of the second generation StrikeEagle 1:6 in second focal plane.
Pew pew.
But as it turns out, this Venom is much different from its brother, the StrikeEagle, and hopefully we'll be able to
Pew pew.
see exactly what the differences are very soon. To the keen-eyed viewer among you,
Pew.
one thing that would be blatantly obvious is the fact that this still uses the AR-BDC 3 reticle as seen with both Gen 2 StrikeEagles in the second focal plane. Now it's true, I haven't played around with the first focal plane StrikeEagles, so maybe they're a little bit more in tune with what this is, especially with the turrets at least, or at least it seems so in pictures.
Pew pew pew.
But let's do a quick unboxing before we go any further into this thing.
Pew pew.
Diving right into the physical unboxing component of this. One thing I must stress is, if I make a comment about how good something feels or how the construction seems to be or the materials used, that's in reference to the $300 that this thing costs. Is this thing going to be the best LPVO if I say, wow, this is really good? It's really good for a $300 optic, not necessarily for all optics, regardless of price point. Nevertheless, for the $300 that you pay for this thing, you get Vortex's lower budget flip caps, which aren't terrible. I would put them on par with some of the primary arm stuff, but they're not as good as Butler Creek's, and they're definitely not the Defender series from Vortex, because they're more of a harder rubber plastic. They slide right off. A little bit of tape will fix that problem, however, and it's nice to know that at least they are included. Now, I did buy this optic brand new with my own money, and well, actually, I could do that thanks to my Patreon and my subscribers, so thank you all very much. So take that into consideration as well. The fast focus eyepiece all the way out with the quarter turn in is very tight and solid, no weird feelings or sounds. It is very fast to adjust. The threads on this thing feel even more aggressive than what they normally seem on most fast focus eyepieces. The splines on all of the touch points are very good. I would say, however, that the eyepiece definitely has the most aggressive texture to it. Moving on to the magnification ring, it is completely standard at 180 degrees of throw between minimum and maximum, and you can see there is no cattail included. However, there is a throw lever included. That's right. Despite the fact that this is a $300 scope, Vortex deemed it necessary or important to throw a throw lever in there. A couple of years ago, you could buy a PST Gen 2, which has basically the exact same magnification ring, with the exact same very shallow dull splines that you can't turn without a throw lever, and they never included it. But with this, they do. The illumination control is a very simple and standard housing. However, you can see that the cap for the battery compartment is very nice and recessed, so you never have to worry about it accidentally coming undone. The PCB board inside is a standard 3 dimple, but it's black, not green, a little unusual. However, the illumination control itself, with its 6 positions with offs in between each on, is quite nice. The aggressive splines on this is very similar to what we saw at the eyepiece. It allows for a very tight, grippy surface to it, so you never have to worry about having your fingers slip off of it. And it does seem, at least right now, that the detents are tight and deep enough that you don't have to worry about this thing accidentally getting changed out of whatever position you leave it on. The splines on the caps for both the windage and elevation turrets are basically the same. Nice, sharp, and deep, allows you to get a really good purchase. The turrets on this scope are excellent to look at. They're set up very well, very easy to read, and very easy to adjust. They're kind of reminiscent of what you'd find on a Razer HD Gen 2, especially more specifically the 1:6, whether it be the E or the non-E. They're big, they're chunky, they allow for a lot of torque and a fair amount of precision to adjust them, but as you can see there is a fair amount of play in these turrets. However, they are much better than what you'd normally find on the StrikeEagles, whether it's the Gen 1 or the Gen 2. In fact, a lot of the lower budget LPVOs will have much shittier turrets than this. The turrets are a definite improvement over what we've seen with the previous generation StrikeEagles. Again, I believe the first focal plane turrets are more in line with these, and I'm just very happy to see that they're coming out with better and better stuff. The last thing we have to talk about is the weight, because it is something that you will notice. At as near as makes no difference, 20 ounces on my scale, it is very heavy. It is really heavy. It's about 3 ounces heavier than other scopes that we're going to be taking a look at later in this segment, and that's a lot. But if those extra 3 ounces is the small price to pay for the weight penalty for how good this thing performs, I'll gladly accept it. So with that, let's get behind this thing and see how it performs in a variety of different atmospheres. The AR-BDC III reticle is very simple and easy to use, very easy to pick up, and I feel scaled really, really well. Those posts at 3, 6, and 9 really draw your eye right to the center where you have a very satisfying circle, dot, and Christmas tree pattern. The little ranging reticle up on top at the 12 o'clock position is a very nice touch for anyone that needs a little bit of help getting their ranging down. Sure, it might not be perfect, it might not be the most accurate at times, especially if you're focusing your attention at varying targets, but on a second focal plane 1 to 6 where you need to be at 6x to properly use this, I don't think it's the end of the world. I really do feel that 1 to 6s in the second focal plane are the ideal LPVO setup, all things considered. Anything higher I would prefer in the first focal plane, but I do feel that 1 to 6s are best set up in the second focal plane. As far as our exit pupil size, there is nothing I could find online as far as how big or how small it would be, but it does seem quite large, as you just saw there at 6x magnification. The illumination on this is also very good. It's not the best, but it doesn't need to be because the reticle is so easy to spot that it just needs to be bright enough when you need it in most environments. Testing the tracking performance on an LPVO like this is going to be a little bit challenging for a couple of reasons, so I'm not going to do a full-on box test and true tracking test like I normally do with all of my higher MPVOs and HPVOs and things with actual like mil turrets for a mil reticle, but I can test to see how well it's going to track on elevation and windage and check the slop in the erectors. This thing performed extremely well. I didn't notice any sort of abnormalities or defects, and I'd say it's a pass. I really do miss having my window in my living room where I could see a 400-yard brick building to use as a stationary point for every single one of my scope reviews. Man, I really do miss that. It sucks. But my backyard ain't half bad. Unfortunately, now that it's, it's late June, the canopy is so thick that you can barely see my paper target that we're going to be paying close attention to very soon. The 1x performance on this is quite good. There is some fisheye to it, but again, for the price point, it really isn't that bad. You can get past it. If I can get past it, almost anybody can get past it. But the view through this thing is really, really large. Like Razor HD levels large. We're going to be, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about when I do my side-by-side comparisons, but just know that it is large, really large. The amount of scope body we see is actually quite minimal, definitely on the thinner side as far as the bezel goes, and as far as the image quality here at 80 yards on my tracking paper target, or at least a spare tracking paper target that I have down there, the image, there's nothing to complain about. There's also nothing to complain about image stability. Both the image and the reticle maintain a very high level of sharpness when we get outside perfect center at 6x. The same can be said for here at 4x. And because it's in the second focal plane, the illumination, which is more than daytime visible in these conditions, stays visible well out into the shadows because That's one of the wonderful perks of second focal plane scopes. Bringing it down to about 3x, and you can see nothing changes. It just gets better and better and better, as it should when we get all the way down to 1x. You will note that the farther we go off center, the more the image is going to start rotating around the center. That is common on any sort of variable powered magnified optic, and something that unfortunately we can't really get away from. At 1x, you can start to see a little bit more of the fisheye towards the center. It's just going to be a little bit more exaggerated as you go down in the magnification range. All in all, though, it's a very good performance for a $300 LPVO. Taking a look at the Eyebox in a more dynamic approach, starting at 1x and working our way up, you can see that you could really get behind this thing in a varying amount of different positions and distances and still be able to use it. I did not notice any parallax shift, meaning that the reticle does not really move on my 80-ish yard target at this distance, which is a good thing. That means that you might not have the perfect cheek weld, you might be in an awkward position, but the center dot of the reticle shouldn't really move that much on target. At 3x, you can get a little bit better view of what I'm trying to refer to. The reticle doesn't really shift on the target all that much, which is a good thing. And at 3x, we have a still fairly forgiving Eyebox, all things considered. Unfortunately, if you wanted to use the reticle at its most maximum potential, you have to be here at 6x. Now, these conditions are very aggressive. It was very, very bright and sunny, but we're looking under a very dark canopy at my target, so the camera settings are a little bit more washed out. But also note that you can see some of the reflection from the back lens, showing that it doesn't have the best coatings in the world as far as glass coatings go. And the better the glass coatings, the better it should perform in lower light environments. At 1x, looking as naked through the camera as we can at our target down there, going through the scope, we do see a little bit loss of brightness, but it's really not a terrible amount. Illumination here gets way too bright at its brightest settings, and you will see going from its brightest settings to its next brightest settings, 6 to 5, there is a huge step down. Not that it's a bad thing, just know that there might not be the ultimate amount of adjustability as far as brightness goes if you are very particular about your brightness settings on your illumination. Slowly increasing the magnification all the way up to its maximum, as long as you have a fixed position on the scope and your eyes don't dilate too much, you shouldn't have a problem using this thing even in lower light environments at its maximum magnification. It's a good performance. It's not a great performance, but most scopes aren't going to perform that great in an environment like this, especially when your eyes start to dilate more at higher magnifications. Let's get into a new environment, one that I will hopefully be able to go to whenever I need to film more longer range stuff. The 1x here, you can see those new power lines in the upper echelon hemisphere of our view looking through it line up pretty damn good. Illumination on full here in this super bright environment is a little lackluster. However, it's still bright enough to create contrast if we were focusing on a dark target in, let's say, a dark canopy. At that point, it would be more than bright enough. The 1x does have a little bit of fisheye. It's a little hard to see with how fast I'm moving, but at least everything seems to line up properly on center. Sometimes you'll be looking through your scope and everything, it might be a good true flat 1x, but it's like shifted up slightly or shifted down. And when you're panning with the scope looking through it, you get a little nauseous. Not so with the Venom. It's actually very good for even more expensive scopes. So for a $300 scope, it's very, very, very good. At 6x, we're going to focus on our first target. That is a 341 yard solar panel. It's about 80 inches by 80 inches. The farther out we go, the larger they're going to get. That second tower is like around the 550, 600 mark. And that third solar tower power, blah, 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 is 1,000 yards out. So this will hopefully be a great indication of its image quality and resolution and sharpness at extended distances. Those power towers way off in the distance, those are like 2,000 yards away. Now, granted, it's not going to be like you're going to be shooting at this stuff in real life. If you are, maybe don't do that. But you can still see that there's a lot of resolution to this glass, all things considered. We can see all of the lacing on all of those towers. You can see a lot of those smaller cables, even at 2,000 yards. Granted, these are like ideal conditions, super bright, super clear day, very low wind. But truth be told, the glass on this thing really does perform a lot better than I would have expected for $300. But let's see what the image stability is going to look like here at 1,000 yards. Similar to what we saw earlier at 6x, slightly shifting off center, both the image and the reticle maintain a very high level of sharpness. And again, that illumination is more than practical for environments even like this. You don't necessarily need super bright illumination unless you can't see the reticle that's trying to illuminate. At 3x, again, could you ask for more in a scope like this? I really don't think so. To contrast this scope with another scope that I had recently looked at, the Primary Arms SLX Nova 1:6 in second focal plane, that and this are actually basically direct competitors to one another. Yes, the Nova is a great scope overall. It's got exceptionally good looking glass, but the image stability falls off like immediately. It's like walking off a cliff. Whereas this maintains a very nice level sharp image. Let's get right into it, ladies and gentlemen. The Venom versus the StrikeEagle Gen 2 1:6 in second focal plane. The Gen 2 StrikeEagle is way better than the Gen 1 StrikeEagle, but this Venom is even better than that. If you were to look at what the Venom looks like versus the first focal plane StrikeEagles, to which I could only really find the 1:8 in first focal plane, externally they look almost identical. So maybe the Venom is the second focal plane version of the first focal plane version of the StrikeEagles, if that makes sense. Both of these feature the AR-BDC 3 reticle like I mentioned earlier, and even though their specs on paper sometimes seem a little bit similar, the real truth is in the pudding. Well, the proof is in the pudding. The proof is in the pudding. There is a huge difference between these, and the view looking through them is, without a shadow or question of doubt, the one that you're going to take the most note of, or at least you should be. Tie that in with the eye relief differences. The Venom is at 3.7 inches, whereas the StrikeEagle is 3.5. So not only is the Venom farther away from your eye, but it also has a much larger view looking through it and less scope body. Now, typically when your eye relief is farther, like in the case of the Venom, sometimes your field of view is going to suffer as a result. Unfortunately for the StrikeEagle, the Venom has much larger field of view. At 100 yards, the Venom's rated at 1x at about 126 feet to the StrikeEagle's 116 feet. That's almost 10%. That's huge. At 6x, as seen here, you go from 20.2 feet for the Venom to 19.2 feet with the StrikeEagle. So not as much of a difference at 6x, but that 1x really starts to add up. At 6x here at 200 yards, granted these were filmed on completely different times of year, like a year or two apart. What can we really say? The StrikeEagle is a very good looking scope. The image on it is quite nice. The sharpness and resolution of the glass is honestly pretty impressive for what it is, a $200 to $300 second focal plane LPVO. But I do have to give the edge to the Venom. It still manages to keep the sharpness and resolution that what the StrikeEagle is capable of producing on the best of times, but in a much larger looking view looking through it, and a more competent package. The turrets on the Venom are much better. The StrikeEagle does have a cattail for the magnification ring, but it's really small and feels like it's just going to shatter off it if you look at it funny. Whereas the Venom's clamp-on throw lever is much more robust, and if it fails, it basically just falls off, and then you can just replace it because Vortex will replace it, as opposed to if you have to pull the threads out of a cattail on the StrikeEagle, you're kind of boned, and you could possibly have to send that in to get fully repaired. The biggest talking point on the StrikeEagle review that I had put out a while ago was that evolution does exist. That is a fact. And the Venom is just a continuing evolution of the StrikeEagle Gen 2s. I like the Venom substantially more than the StrikeEagle Gen 2s, and I like the StrikeEagles, or at least the Gen 2 1:6 in second focal plane. I prefer that over the SIG Tango MSR a little bit. That means that I prefer the Venom over that by a considerable margin. The Venom so far is shaping up to be a very competitive scope in this segment. The next competitor is going to be another Vortex product. This time it's going to be the excellent PST Gen 2 1:6 in second focal plane. The PST is 85% what a Razer HD is, but less than half the price. The Venom is, as near as makes no difference, half the price of the PST. And I want you to really look at these two images side by side and tell me, is there that much of a difference that on a blind test that you'd be able to tell the difference between these two? I reckon if you had no idea what was what, you'd have a hard time picking it out. However, I can just make out the slightly sharper, clear image to the PST Gen 2, but it doesn't seem like that all the time. The specs don't lie, folks, and when you start looking at these numbers side by side, you could really see just how impressive the Venom really is. Even though the Venom is heavy, it's still almost 3 ounces lighter than the PST Gen 2 at basically 20 ounces. It's about a half inch shorter than the PST Gen 2, and it even has larger field of view than the PST Gen 2, partly because it has a larger view looking through it. The field of view almost follows suit, especially when the eye reliefs are quite close to one another. You have 3.7 inches for the Venom, 3.8 for the PST. As far as the field of view goes, what Vortex claims anyway, you have 112.5 feet at 1x for the PST, and again that 126 for the Venom. Their maximum, you might be asking, 18.8 for the PST, and again that 20.2. Is that the only thing that I'm going to base which one I'd prefer between these scopes on? No. Oh, hello there, kitty cat. No, I can't just base it on that alone. Specs are specs, and yes, we use those specs to be able to help determine what scope might be better in some way, shape, or form, but ultimately getting behind it, using it, and testing it out is what ultimately is going to determine which is the better scope, especially if you have a personal preference for one versus the other. I have a lot of experience behind a PST Gen 2, and I know a lot of other people that have as well, and have trusted them ever since. They're very robust. They're made in the Philippines versus made in China. Yes, they're bigger and heavier and more expensive, but I do think you are getting a better scope, despite the fact that the numbers on the spec sheets might sway you in the way of the Venom being the better scope. The PST is just, it's a sledgehammer, and it's something that I would still choose over the Venom unless I couldn't afford the PST, in which case the Venom really is something to behold. C. Tell me you're going to be comparing this against the Nova. No, I am not. And the reason is I choose the PST over the Nova, and I have a very extensive long review of those two side by side. So if you want to find out what the PST looks like next to the Nova, and then you could figure out what the Nova would look like next to this, go for it. Because this review, I'm going to try to keep a little bit on the trimmer side. Next up, though, is going to be what I consider to be one of the best second focal plane 1-6s on the market, next to a Razer HD Gen 2. The only reason why I'm not going to roll in one of those is because I don't have modern enough footage through one to be able to do a direct comparison side by side. So the next best thing is the Trijicon TR25. The Trijicon TR25 second focal plane 1-6 is a Japanese-made, very robust, very simple, very effective and efficient LPVO. They are made in Japan, so now we've seen China versus China, China versus the Philippines, and now China versus Japan. Now, no, I'm not trying to turn this into some hot debate as far as which country produces the best scopes. The Trijicon is a much older model by age as far as designation and production, or at least initial production, but it could still perform extremely well. You might not like the reticle on the TR25. This red post is not for everybody. But Trijicon is nice enough to offer the TR25 with a host of different reticle options for your personal pleasure. As far as how these two look side by side, I gotta give it to the TR25. It's got a little bit sharper image, a little bit higher contrast, and the overall image looking through it is a little bit better edge to edge, center to center for me. Everyone's going to look at this differently. Again, these were filmed on completely different days, but you could still get a sense of how these two are going to perform side by side against one another. Now, during my TR25 review, I mentioned that getting behind it was impressive because the view looking through it was so large. But nevertheless, ladies and gentlemen, the Venom is still larger. That really just goes to show how impressive the Venom can be. As far as the stats, real quick, you're going to be spending about 3 times the amount on a TR25 as opposed to a Venom. Weight-wise, they're basically the same. Length-wise, the TR25 will be about 3/4 of an inch longer. Field of view, you're talking about 117.5 to 126. So again, definitely heavily favoring the Venom. And on the top end, you have 18 feet versus 20.2 feet. And the eye relief on the TR25 is about 1/4 inch farther. However, these two really can't occupy the same space because the TR25 feels like it's a tank and you can take it off your gun and, hammer nails with it if you so choose. I bought this scope on a whim. I had some money that I had just gotten from selling a product, and I forgot the website that had this for sale. It was like low to mid 200s, shipped to my door, and I said, you know what? I haven't reviewed any lower price tiered LPVOs in a long time. The last one I think was the SLX Nova, and that review did exceptionally well. It's a very good scope, all things considered. I like a lot about it, but there are 1 or 2 things that I really don't like about it. Most notably is the image stability when you're slightly off center when you get behind it. Again, if you're cross-shopping this and that, go check out the full review on that to get a better feel for what might suit your needs better. I really wasn't too sure what to expect with this scope. I've been out of the loop for a lot of things since buying my house, and it's just been one project after another, and it's burying me. So I wasn't really too up to speed on a lot of the newer stuff from Vortex. They seem to be churning out a lot of new products lately, and that's great because new products just means more for us to be able to enjoy. But I got my hands on this and I opened up the box and I pull it out and I look through it and I'm like, there's something about this that just seems good, just seems special. The first time you get your hands on this and you get behind it and you look through it, you're going to realize, if you aren't aware, that the view through this thing really is huge. It's humongous. And I'm a big fan of that. However, that is a very uncommon thing on lower priced optics, especially LPVOs for some reason. Primarily because to get a very large view looking through it, you're basically going to be magnifying all the imperfections in the lower quality glass. So that's why you typically see a lot of the lower end scopes having smaller views looking through it, because it compresses all of those imperfections in the glass to make the image look a little bit sharper. Pretend you have a low quality JPEG image of whatever it is, and you zoom into it really far. You see these giant big blocky pixels. Now you zoom out really far. All of a sudden, you can see what that image actually looks like because all those big giant gloopy pixels are now being compressed. Same concept applies here. The Venom manages to have a giant view looking through it, but the image doesn't really suck. Are there some minor gripes that I can complain about? Sure, I've already talked about that way too much. But the only thing to really talk about that's a negative, there is some distortion in the magnification ranges, most notably at 1x, but you could see even there, panning across from target to target, there is a little fisheye effect. That's not going to be as noticeable in the higher magnifications because typically you're going to be in higher magnifications and focus on a target and look through that or look past that. Tie that all together with that you're probably going to be in a more stable position and not really paying attention to that, so it's something that you'll probably never even notice. At the end of all of this 28, almost 29 minute long review, would I recommend this? Can I recommend this? And should you buy it? Yes, yes, and yes. If you're on the fence, I would say go for it. If you're cross-shopping this versus the Primary Arms SLX Nova, go watch my full review of that and make your own deduction as what's going to be better for you. Because even though on paper they're actually quite close, like we've already seen, you might have some scopes that are really close on paper. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be direct competitors to one another or something that you should consider just because some of the numbers are higher. If all things were equal, though, this thing really does prove itself worthy of your potential money. I really do think it is a home run and something that I will be using more in the near future. I've already sold my StrikeEagle Gen II, and I'm going to probably sell my Sig Tango MSR, and I'm going to keep this right next to my PST Gen II and see if it can even hope to hold on through all the abuse that I'll be giving it over the years. And if it can do that, then Vortex, you nailed this one pretty freaking good. With that, thank you all very much for watching. And as always, see you again next time. And a huge thank you to my Patreon providers and my Subscribe Star subscribers. Without you, this truly wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to support my channel but don't want to join either of those, I completely understand. But you could still help by using my affiliate links in the description below, and or like, share, and subscribe as always. Again, thank you very much.